One stranger, one blizzard night, one decision that changed everything. At 52, Rose Whitlock was already preparing to lose, not her life, but something slower and crueler than death, the last piece of everything she had ever built. The bank was weeks away from taking her land. Both sons had vanished without a word, and the Montana winter was closing in like a fist. She had stopped expecting anything from the world except more of the same. Then the blizzard came, the worst in decades, and with it, a knock at the door. A stranger, mud and frost on his coat, empty hands held where she could see them, eyes that carried the particular stillness of a man who had been alone so long he had forgotten how to ask for anything. She had every reason to leave that door closed. She knew it then, and she knows it now. But something in her, the same stubborn, bone-deep refusal that had kept her standing when everything else fell, made her reach for the latch. One widow. One mountain man with nothing to offer but honesty. One winter that was about to become the rest of their lives. Hit like, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. Then stay with me, because what happens next will cost you everything you thought you knew about it being too late. The wind came first. It always did in Montana. The wind announced itself like a drunk man at a funeral, loud and without shame, rattling the window frames of the Whitlock homestead before the snow even had the decency to show its face. Rose had lived through 31 winters on this land, and she had learned to read them the way other women read letters, slowly, carefully, bracing for the worst before the words even settled. This one was going to be bad. She could feel it in the particular way the cold moved through the gaps in the cabin walls. Not creeping, like most winter drafts, but driving, insistent, as though the cold had somewhere urgent to be. She could feel it in the way the horses had grown restless in the barn 2 hours ago, stamping and blowing hard, that animal instinct warning of something no human calendar had yet marked. Rose Whitlock set down her mending and stood at the single front window of the cabin, looking out across the valley. The last of the November daylight was being swallowed whole. The spruce trees on the ridgeline were already swaying like grieving women, bending so far in the gust that she half expected to hear them snap. The sky had turned the color of a bruise, that deep, ugly yellow-gray that old-timers called a killing sky, for good reason. She pressed her palm flat against the glass. The cold bit straight through to her bones. 30 days, she thought, maybe less. That was what Harlan Beecroft at the Mineral County Bank had told her 6 weeks ago, sitting behind his wide-oak desk with his soft hands folded and his face arranged in an expression that was meant to look like sympathy, but was really just discomfort. The kind of face a man makes when he's about to tell you something terrible, but doesn't want to carry the weight of it. "Mrs. Whitlock," he'd said, his voice pitched low as though keeping the news quiet might soften it. "The mortgage has been in arrears for 14 months now. The bank has been patient, but there are limits to what patience can accomplish." "I know what I owe," she had told him. She had not let her voice shake. She had promised herself that much. "Then you understand that unless the full balance, $462, is settled before the 1st of January, the property will revert to the bank and be listed for auction." He had paused. "I'm sorry, Rose. Truly." She had nodded once, gathered her coat, and walked out into the October cold without another word. She had not cried until she was 3 miles down the road, alone on the buckboard with the old draft horse Biscuit plodding patient and steady beneath a gray sky. She had cried hard and ugly and without grace, the kind of crying that has nothing to do with softness and everything to do with a person finally running out of the energy it takes to hold things together. Then she had wiped her face, squared her jaw, and started calculating. The homestead had been her husband Thomas's dream first, and hers by love, and then hers by necessity when Thomas died of pneumonia 6 winters ago, leaving behind a half-finished barn, 2 teenage boys who didn't know how to grieve without fighting, and a piece of land that wanted everything from a person and gave back only what it felt like giving. She had managed. That was what Rose did. She managed. She stretched every dollar until it screamed, grew her own kitchen garden, traded labor with the Hargrove family 2 valleys over, and kept the creditors at the edge of the property instead of through the door. For a while, she had even believed she might truly build something here, something lasting. Then the boys left. Elias first. Her eldest, 23 years old, broad-shouldered like his father, with none of Thomas's patience. They had fought the winter after Thomas died, a real fight, the kind that leaves marks that don't fade. She still wasn't entirely sure what the fight had been about. Loss, maybe. The way grief made people mean before it made them soft. Elias had packed a canvas bag one morning in February, saddled his horse, and ridden east without saying goodbye. She had received 3 letters in the years since. The last one was dated 18 months ago, postmarked from somewhere in Wyoming. Silas was different, younger, gentler, with his mother's eyes and his father's restlessness. He had left on better terms, at least. He was 20 when he went, talking about cattle drives and wide-open country and opportunities west. He'd sent money twice in the first year, cheerful letters about a cowboy's life that made Rose smile even when she was exhausted. Then the letters slowed. Then they stopped. She told herself he was fine. She told herself this the way she told herself a lot of things, firmly, without room for argument, because the alternative was too heavy to carry. By the second winter alone, she had understood something that no one had prepared her for. Loneliness was not the same as sadness. Sadness was an emotion. Loneliness was a condition, like weather, like altitude, like the particular quality of silence that settles into a house when no one else has spoken in it for days. She had learned to live inside that silence. She had even, some mornings, made her peace with it. But the money was a different kind of problem entirely, and no amount of making peace solved arithmetic. The blizzard hit full force just after dark. Rose had already brought in extra wood, checked the barn twice, made sure the latch on the chicken coop was properly fastened. She moved through these preparations with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had long since stopped expecting help from anyone but herself. The cabin was small but solid. Thomas had built it to last, whatever else could be said about him. And she had layered every blanket she owned onto her narrow bed and stoked the wood stove until it threw heat like a furnace. She was heating water for chicory coffee when the sound stopped her. Not the wind. She knew the wind. This was different. A rhythm beneath the storm's chaos, something that didn't belong to weather. She stood perfectly still, her hand on the cast-iron pot, and listened. Knock-a-knock, knock-a-mo, no-kick. 3 deliberate strikes against her front door, spaced like a man who is using the last of his strength to make himself heard. Rose set the pot down very slowly. She crossed to the fireplace and took down the double-barreled shotgun that hung on iron pegs above the mantel. She checked that both chambers were loaded, they always were, and moved toward the door. "Who's there?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. A pause. Then, muffled badly by the howling wind, "Traveler. Lost my horse. Just need shelter until the storm passes. I won't cause trouble." The voice was low and rough, scraped raw by cold, but it carried something underneath the exhaustion. A particular flatness, not aggressive, not desperate in the wild way that dangerous men got desperate. Just tired. Bone-deep tired. Rose stood with her hand on the door latch and the shotgun in her other hand, and she thought about every sensible reason not to open it. She was a woman alone. It was the middle of the night in the worst storm in years. She did not know this man. She could not see his face. She thought about all of this. Then she thought about what it would feel like to be on the other side of that door. She opened it. The man who stood on her porch was not what she expected, though she couldn't have said precisely what she'd expected. He was tall, a full head above her, wide through the shoulders but spare everywhere else, the kind of lean that comes from years of hard living rather than want. His coat was elk-hide, heavy and stiffened with snow, and his hat had long since stopped being useful against the kind of storm currently swallowing the world behind him. Ice had formed in his dark beard. His hands, she noticed immediately, were hanging empty and visible at his sides, deliberately so, she realized. He had arranged himself so that she could see he wasn't reaching for anything. He was looking at the shotgun with the calm, assessing eyes of a man who had looked at guns before and survived the experience. "Ma'am." His voice was calmer now that he was out of the wind, or at least slightly out of it. "I rode into a gully about a mile and a half back, coming down off Redtail Ridge. Horse broke a leg. Had to put her down." Something moved through his face at that. Brief, quickly controlled, but real. "I saw your light. Walk toward it." Rose studied him across the barrel of the gun. His lips had gone the wrong color. She knew that color. She'd seen it on Thomas the winter he got caught out in a late March storm. That bluish gray that meant the cold had moved past discomfort into something that required intervention. "You've got maybe another hour outside before you stop feeling your hands," she said. "Yes, ma'am. I expect that's about right." "There a reason I shouldn't shut this door?" He held her gaze. He didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't try to charm or cajole. He just said, quietly, "No, ma'am. There isn't one I can offer you that you'd have cause to believe." The honesty of it surprised her more than anything else he might have said. She stepped back from the doorway. "Wipe your boots. Coat on the peg. You'll sleep on the floor by the stove, and I'll keep this—" She raised the shotgun slightly, close at hand. "Understood." He stepped inside and she closed the door against the howling dark. His name was Caleb Mercer. She learned this in stages, the way you learn anything about a careful man, slowly, in pieces, without the sense that he was withholding exactly, but that he simply wasn't accustomed to being asked. He was 41 years old, though he could have been anywhere from 35 to 50. The outdoors had written its own story on his face, and she wasn't sure the years were the most important chapter. He had been trapping in the mountains above the valley for the better part of a decade, working a line of 40-odd traps from early fall through late winter, selling his pelts to a trader in Millhaven twice a season. "You do this alone?" Rose asked. She was sitting across the room with the shotgun leaning against her chair, within arm's reach but no longer leveled at him. She had made him a tin cup of chicory coffee, more out of the efficiency of a Montana woman who understood that dead guests were bad guests than out of any particular warmth. She had watched him wrap both hands around the cup with the particular reverence of a man reacquainting himself with heat. Alone, yes. He said it without self-pity. It was simply a fact about his life, the way the altitude was a fact about the mountains. "No family?" "No." Another flat fact. Parents had been gone 20 years, no siblings, no wife. He looked into his cup. "You?" "Widow, 6 years." He nodded, accepting this the way he seemed to accept everything, without performance. "Children?" he asked. The word landed with its particular weight, the way it always did when someone asked it, and she had to decide how much truth to load into the answer. "2 sons," she said. "Gone." She didn't elaborate, and he didn't press. Another point in his favor, though she wasn't making a ledger yet. Or so she told herself. The storm raged for 3 days. By the end of the first night, Rose had confirmed, to her own cautious satisfaction, that Caleb Mercer was not going to murder her in her sleep. He slept when she indicated he could sleep, woke when the sound of her moving around the cabin woke him, and spent the first full day mending a section of harness that she'd been putting off for weeks, working with the focused, quiet competence of a man who was uncomfortable with idleness. He didn't make conversation unless she initiated it. He ate what she offered without complaint and without excess. He was courteous in the particular way of people who have spent enough time truly alone that manners have stopped being social performance and become something more fundamental, a way of taking up space that didn't impose on others. By the second day, she found herself talking to him more than she'd talked to anyone in months. Not about important things at first. The weather, the condition of her woodpile, the particular stubbornness of the cow, named Esther after a woman Rose had once known, who shared the same characteristic refusal to do anything on anyone else's timeline. Caleb listened the way good listeners do, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually receiving what she said, sometimes asking a question that showed he'd been paying attention. "How long have you been working this land alone?" he asked on the afternoon of the second day. He was at the window, watching the storm continue its assault on the valley, and she was at the table going over her account books, something she'd taken to doing in the evenings like a kind of penance, running her finger down the columns of figures that told the same unpleasant story no matter how many times she reviewed them. 6 years mostly alone, she said. The boys were here for the first 2. Mostly alone is different from entirely alone. Yes. She closed the account book. It is. He turned from the window and looked at her. Really looked, with a directness that she'd noticed from the beginning. Not invasive, not challenging, simply present. "You're going to lose this place," he said. It wasn't a question. She felt a flicker of something sharp. "You don't know that." "No. But you've been looking at those books like they've been telling you something you don't want to hear, and people don't look at numbers like that unless the numbers are winning." He said it without cruelty, just observation. "How much?" She should have told him it was none of his concern, but the storm was howling outside and she was exhausted from carrying this particular weight alone. And there was something about the particular quality of his attention. That flatness that she was beginning to understand wasn't coldness, but rather a kind of stillness that made the truth feel less dangerous than usual. $462, she said. By the 1st of January, he was quiet for a moment. That's a lot of money for one person. Yes, she said. It is. The storm broke on the third morning. The world outside the cabin had been remade while they weren't watching. Buried under 3 feet of clean white silence, the ridgeline softened, the creek invisible beneath a skin of ice. The entire valley transformed into something that might have been beautiful if you weren't immediately calculating how long it would take to dig out, and whether the chickens had survived and whether the fence posts had held. Rose was pulling on her boots to go check the barn when Caleb said, "I'll get the barn." She looked up. "That's not necessary." "I know it's not necessary." He was already reaching for his coat. She'd managed to dry it and work most of the stiffening out during the second day. "I'm offering." She watched him for a moment. "You'll be wanting to get back to your traps." "My traps aren't going anywhere." He paused with the coat half on. "Mrs. Whitlock, I lost my horse. I lost 3 days to that storm. I've got supplies cached on the mountain that'll keep, and I've got nothing urgent pulling me anywhere." He looked at her steadily. "Let me be useful while I'm here." There was a long pause in which Rose considered all the reasons this was a bad idea. The talk it would generate in Millhaven when word got around, the complications of a strange man on her property, the particular vulnerability of beginning to rely on someone who had no reason to stay. "There's fence line down on the north side," she said finally. "I saw it go in the storm. If the cattle get through before I can push them back—" "I'll check the fence first," he said, "then the barn." He went out into the white silence without waiting for her to change her mind. He stayed a week, then 2. She couldn't have said precisely when the arrangement shifted from temporary shelter to something else. Some unspoken agreement, never formalized, never even directly discussed, that he would remain and work and that this was reasonable and appropriate. It happened the way these things happen when 2 practical people are faced with practical problems. Organically, without ceremony, in the daily accumulation of shared labor. He was a remarkable worker. Rose had known hard workers. Thomas had been one, her father before him. But Caleb worked with a particular quality of focused endurance that she found herself watching sometimes with something close to wonder. He pushed through the deep snow to check and reset his remaining trap lines, returning in the evenings with pelts that he stretched and dried in the barn. He repaired the broken fence line. He split 3 weeks' worth of wood in 2 days with a methodical rhythm that she could hear from inside the cabin. Thwack, 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 like a heartbeat the homestead hadn't had in years. He reinforced the barn walls where the worst of the winter had been working at the boards, and he did it without being asked, having simply noticed the problem the way a person notices things when they're paying attention. In exchange, she fed him, genuinely fed him, not the grudging minimum, but real food, because a working man needed fuel and she was practical enough not to mistake frugality for virtue when the situation didn't call for it. She washed his spare shirt when he wasn't wearing it. She let him keep his gear in the barn. And they talked. In the evenings, by the stove's warmth while the cold pressed at the windows, they talked. Slowly, carefully, with the particular tentative quality of people who have been alone long enough that conversation has become both a luxury and a skill requiring practice. He told her about the mountains, not the romantic version that outsiders sometimes carried, but the real version, the working reality of high-altitude winters, and the particular personalities of different animals, and the way the snow moved differently depending on elevation and slope and wind direction. He spoke about these things with a quiet, precise love that she recognized because she felt the same way about her land. She told him about Thomas, about the early years, when the homestead had been an adventure rather than a burden, when she and Thomas had been young and ridiculous and convinced that hard work and wanting something badly enough would always be sufficient. About the boys when they were small. Elias at 6 years old, serious beyond his years and already deeply concerned about fairness. Silas at 4, laughing at everything, following his brother everywhere like a determined shadow. "What happened?" Caleb asked one evening. "With the boys. If you don't mind me asking." Rose was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "Thomas's death happened," she said finally. Grief happened. We were all in the same house with the same loss, and we each went through it alone because that's what people do, even when they shouldn't. She paused. Elias and I said things to each other, ugly things, the kind that have a way of becoming permanent. She turned her cup in her hands. And Silas just needed to move. He was always like that. When something hurt him, he ran toward the horizon until the hurt got smaller. And now? And now I don't know where either of them is. She said it plainly. And the bank is going to take this land in 6 weeks, and there is nothing I am going to be able to do about it, and I will lose the last thing I have that connects me to the family I built. She hadn't meant to say all of that. It came out the way water comes through a cracked dam. Once the first breach is made, the rest follows. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What would it take to close that gap?" "In money?" She almost laughed. "A miracle. What's the actual number between what you have and what you need?" "I've saved $60 this fall. I need $462." She shook her head. "I know what you're thinking. The pelts. Even a good season doesn't bridge $400. Not from pelts alone, no." He leaned forward, his forearms on his knees, looking at her with that direct, considering attention that she was learning was simply how he thought, out loud, carefully, without decoration. "But there's the lumber contract that Halverson's mill is running. They need winter cutters, pays $40 a month. And your south pasture, the soil there is better than you're using it for. If we put in a spring kitchen garden and ran it heavy, we could sell surplus to the Millhaven General Store." "We." She said it before she could stop herself. He stopped. She watched something careful move through his expression. "I misspoke," he said quietly. "Did you?" A long pause. The fire cracked and settled. Outside, the wind moved through the spruce trees with a low, persistent sound like something breathing. "No," he said finally. "I don't think I did." They did not speak of it again that night. But in the morning, Caleb Mercer was still there when Rose came out to start the fire. He had the coffee going already, chicory again, because that was what she had, and he handed her a cup without a word and went out to start on the morning chores. And something between them had shifted in the night in the way that tectonic things shift, invisibly, profoundly, and with consequences neither of them had yet begun to measure. Rose stood at the window with her cup and watched him cross the snow-covered yard toward the barn, his breath clouding in the cold morning air, and she thought, "This is the most dangerous thing that has happened to you in years." She thought about how far she had come, alone, on nothing but stubbornness and necessity. She thought about the indignity of needing anyone. She thought about Elias's voice the last time she'd heard it, hard with anger. She thought about Silas's letters slowing to silence. She thought about Thomas in the early years, laughing in the field at something she'd said, and the way that laughing had felt like a country she would never visit again. She thought about $462 and a foreclosure notice in 6 weeks. She thought about a man who had knocked on her door in a blizzard with nothing to offer but empty hands and the particular honesty of someone who had stopped pretending. Then she finished her coffee, set down her cup, and went outside to help. The talk started in December. It was inevitable, Rose supposed. The frontier was efficient at gossip in inverse proportion to the actual distance between people. A woman's hired man who wasn't exactly hired, who showed up after a blizzard and didn't leave, who was seen in the company of a widow of a certain age by the Hargrove boys on their way through the valley. This was more than sufficient material. She heard it first from Mabel Trent at the general store in Millhaven, delivered in that particular tone of women who frame cruelty as concern. "People are talking, Rose," Mabel said, measuring flour with unnecessary focus, "about that man at your place." "People can talk about whatever they like," Rose said. "That's generally how talking works." "He's what, 40? You're 52, Rose. People are wondering what his intentions are." "His intentions are to work, which is more than can be said for the people doing the wondering." She took her flour and her change and she walked out, and she kept her back straight all the way to the buckboard, and she didn't let herself feel the particular burn of small-town judgment until she was alone on the road. But it stung. She wouldn't pretend otherwise. Not for herself. She had made peace with what people thought of her long ago, that particular freedom that came with a life that left no room for performance. It stung for him, for Caleb, who had done nothing but work himself half to death for a woman he'd stumbled upon in a blizzard. She told him about it that evening. She had decided she wouldn't, decided it was her business to handle, but then changed her mind because the decision felt too much like the old habit of carrying everything alone. He listened without expression, his hand still around his cup. When she finished, he said, "Does it change anything? For me? No. Then it doesn't matter. It's not quite that simple." "It's not." He looked at her. "But it's not quite that complicated either." She studied him across the table. "You're not bothered by it." "I've been called worse things than whatever they're calling me." He said it simply. "And I've learned that what people say about your choices matters a lot less than whether your choices were the right ones." "And was this one?" she asked. "The right one?" "Staying." He considered the question with the same deliberate honesty he gave everything. "I don't know yet," he said, "but it doesn't feel like a wrong one." By mid-December, they had a plan. It was not a comfortable plan. It required Caleb to work the lumber contract in Millhaven 3 days a week on top of his trap line, returning to the homestead in the evenings half frozen and wrung out, eating whatever Rose kept warm for him, and sleeping the deep sleep of a man who had used everything he had. It required Rose to push her own work harder than she had in years, running the homestead alone on the days he was gone, preserving everything she could from the kitchen garden, negotiating with the Millhaven store owner, a shrewd man named Petford who respected nothing but leverage over the price of her surplus goods. The dollars came slowly, too slowly. By Christmas Eve, which Rose marked with nothing more ceremonious than an extra log on the fire and a small portion of preserved peaches she'd been saving since September, they were still short by more than $200, and the 1st of January was a week away. Caleb came in from the cold that evening and sat across from her at the table, and they looked at the numbers together in silence, and Rose felt the exhaustion of the past months settle into her bones like sediment. "We're not going to make it," she said. She said it quietly, without drama. It was simply the truth. Caleb was very still. He was looking at the numbers, but his eyes had the inward quality of a man working through something private. "Caleb." She said his name for the first time without thinking about it, and noticed distantly that it came easily. You've done everything you could, more than you had any reason to. If the bank takes this place, that's not—" "I have money," he said. She stopped. He looked up from those numbers. "Saved over the years. In a bank in Millhaven, under my name." He said it flatly, without sentiment. "I don't have a house. I don't have land. I've been living in the mountains and putting money away and never spending it because I never had anything I wanted to spend it on." A pause. "The amount I have would cover what we're short." The word we sat between them like a stone dropped into still water. "Caleb," she kept her voice very even. "That's your life. That's years of—" "I know what it is." He met her gaze. "Rose, I know what I'm saying." She was quiet for a long time. Outside, the Christmas Eve wind moved through the valley. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once and was answered by silence. "Why?" she asked finally. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something move through those steady, dark eyes. Something that had been there, she thought, for a while, moving quietly beneath the surface of a man who had stopped believing in surfaces. "Because this place deserves to survive," he said. "And so do you." It was not the words of a man who was after land or money or whatever else the people in Millhaven suspected. It was the words of a man who meant exactly what he said and not a syllable more. Rose Whitlock, who had not cried in front of another living person in 6 years, felt her eyes fill. She did not let the tears fall, but she let him see them there, which was its own kind of surrender. "You'd have to trust me to pay it back," she said. "I already trust you," he said. "That's not the complicated part." "Then what is?" He almost smiled, the smallest movement, barely there, at the corner of his mouth. "Asking you if that's what you want. Not just the money, all of it." The fire cracked. The wind moved against the windows. Rose Whitlock looked across the table at this man who had knocked on her door in a blizzard and stayed, who had worked her land without being asked and kept her company without being invited, who had looked at her life with its weight and its loneliness and its stubborn, precarious hope, and chosen to put himself into it. She was 52 years old. She was not a woman who had ever done anything by halves. "Yes," she said, "that's what I want." The valley was very quiet on Christmas Eve. The kind of quiet that only comes when the world has been thoroughly buried in snow and the cold has driven everything with sense into shelter. In the Whitlock homestead, the wood stove burned steadily, and two people sat at a small table in its warmth and made the kind of decision that cannot be unmade. Not because it was rash, but because it was exactly right. And things that are exactly right have a way of becoming permanent, whether you plan for it or not. Outside, 3 feet deep in snow, the homestead waited. The barn, the fence lines, the south pasture that would need turning come April. The land that had taken everything from Rose Whitlock and was about to, against all reasonable expectation, give something back. It did not know the story was only beginning. The 1st of January arrived cold and clear, the kind of morning that looked beautiful from inside a warm room and tried to kill you the moment you stepped outside. Rose was already awake when the light came. She had been awake for most of the night, not from worry, which surprised her, but from something closer to the strange, unsettled energy of a person who has made a large decision and is only now beginning to understand its full dimensions. Caleb had ridden into Millhaven 2 days after Christmas. He had not made a ceremony of it, simply told her he was going, saddled the borrowed mare from old Hendricks down the valley, and come back 4 hours later with the bank draft folded in his coat pocket and the same expression he wore when he'd finished splitting wood or mending fence. Task completed, next task. He handed the draft to Rose across the kitchen table and poured himself coffee without being asked, because by now he knew where everything in her kitchen lived, and she found that she didn't mind. She had looked at the numbers on the draft for a long moment. $208. A decade of a man's solitary labor, distilled into paper. Caleb, don't, he said, not unkindly. Just go pay the bank. She went and paid the bank. Harlan Beecroft had looked at her across his wide oak desk with something she couldn't quite classify. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. The way a man looks when the world has not behaved the way he expected it to. He counted the money twice, filled out the receipt with his careful clerk's handwriting, and slid it across to her. The mortgage is settled through March, he said. You'll need to maintain payments going forward, Mrs. Whitlock. The bank can't keep extending. I understand the terms, she said. I always have. She walked out into the January cold with the receipt in her pocket and stood on the wooden sidewalk of Millhaven's main street and breathed the sharp air and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten its name. Room. Not freedom exactly. The work was still enormous, the future still uncertain, the land still demanding everything she had. But room. The sensation of not being pressed from all sides by an imminent catastrophe. She allowed herself 30 seconds of it. Then she climbed back on the buckboard and drove home. The news moved through Millhaven the way news always did, faster than reason could account for, and with embellishments that grew with each retelling. By the second week of January, the story being told at Petford's General Store and the Millhaven feed supply and overback fences in the cold was that the widow Whitlock had taken in a mountain man, that he had paid off her debts, and that the two of them were living together in a manner that decent folk found troubling. The details shifted depending on who was doing the telling, but the conclusion was consistent. Something improper was occurring at the Whitlock homestead, and someone ought to say something. Someone did. His name was Gerald Cutter, and he owned the largest cattle operation in the valley and sat on the county land commission and had, Rose suspected, harbored a quiet interest in the Whitlock parcel for years. The south pasture, in particular, which bordered his own grazing land and would have been a convenient acquisition had the bank sold it at auction. He arrived at her property on a Wednesday morning in mid-January with two of his ranch hands flanking him on horseback, which Rose recognized as the frontier version of bringing backup to a conversation. She saw them coming from the window and went out to meet them on the porch, rather than wait to be knocked upon. She had found, in her years managing men and creditors in difficult weather, that the person who comes out to meet trouble is generally at an advantage over the person who lets it come to them. Gerald? She kept her voice neutral. This is a working morning. What do you need? Cutter was a big man who had once been hard and was now soft in the way of men who had hired other people to do their hardness for them. He sat his horse with the elaborate ease of someone reminding you that he can afford a good one. Rose! He nodded at her with the particular familiarity of a man who has decided his age and position entitle him to a woman's first name without invitation. I'll be direct. People in town are concerned. People in town are occupied, she said. Whether that occupation constitutes concern is between them and their own consciences. There's a man living on your property. There's a man working on my property. The distinction matters. One of the ranch hands shifted in his saddle. Cutter ignored him. Rose, you're a widow woman, alone out here. I understand times have been hard. Times have been fine. She kept her hands loose at her sides. The shotgun was just inside the door, and she suspected Cutter knew it. The bank is paid. The ranch is running. Whatever concern brought you out here this morning, you can carry it back with you. Where is he? Oh! Cutter looked past her toward the barn. That's not information I'm offering. She stepped slightly to the side, not aggressively, but enough to redirect his sightline back to her face. Gerald, I'm going to say this plainly, because we've known each other long enough for plain speech. This is my land. It was my husband's land, and it is my land now, and the people on it are my business. If you've come out here because you're genuinely worried about my welfare, I thank you and tell you I'm fine. If you've come out here for some other reason, I'd prefer you didn't bother making up a more polite one. There was a silence in which Cutter's expression moved through several adjustments. He was not a stupid man, and he recognized when a position was properly held. People talk, he said finally, more quietly. People always talk, Rose said. Good morning, Gerald. She went back inside and listened to the hoofbeats until they faded down the road, and then she leaned against the closed door for a moment with her eyes shut and her heart going considerably faster than her expression had suggested. That was Gerald Cutter, Caleb said from behind her. She turned. He was in the doorway to the kitchen, having come in the back, a length of harness leather in his hands that he'd been working on. I watched from the barn window. I know you did. You didn't need me out there. No, she agreed, but I'm aware that required some patience on your part. Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent. More than some. He looked at her steadily. He's going to come back. Probably. Or send someone who's less polite about it. Also probably. She pushed off from the door and moved toward the kitchen. Which means we need to give them less to work with, not more. She paused. I've been thinking about that. He followed her into the kitchen, and she turned to face him. She had been thinking about it, in truth, since New Year's, quietly, in the way she thought about serious things, turning it over and examining it from different angles before she trusted herself to speak about it aloud. People are going to talk regardless, she said. We can't stop that, but we can change what they're talking about. He waited, watching her. I'm not a woman who does things by halves, she said, which he already knew, and I'm not a woman who lets other people's opinions govern her choices, but I am a practical woman. And practically speaking, she held his gaze. If we're going to do this, we should do it properly. Define properly, he said, very quietly. Properly, she said, means that what you put into this place, you have a rightful claim to. It means we're not two people occupying an ambiguous arrangement that gives Gerald Cutter and Mabel Trent and everyone else in Millhaven something to pick apart. She paused. It means I'm asking you a question, Caleb, and I need you to understand that I'm not asking it out of desperation or propriety or what the town will think. I'm asking it because I have spent 6 years being alone, and I have recently discovered that I prefer— She stopped, collected herself, that I prefer this. What this is. Whatever it is. Caleb Mercer set down the harness leather on the kitchen table. He looked at her with those steady, dark eyes that she had spent 2 months learning to read, and what she saw in them was not surprise. He had been, she realized, waiting for this, not impatiently, not with any pressure applied, but waiting the way a man waits when he already knows the answer to a question he hasn't yet been asked. Rose Whitlock, he said, are you proposing to me? I'm asking you a question, she said, with as much dignity as she could manage while her heart behaved in the unseemly manner it was currently behaving. Which you haven't answered. Yes, he said, simply, completely, without embellishment. Yes, that's my answer. She let out a breath she'd been holding, she suspected, for considerably longer than this conversation. Good, she said. That's settled then. He almost laughed. The closest thing to it she'd heard from him, a low sound in his chest. That's settled, he agreed. They were married by the county magistrate in Millhaven on the 14th of February. which Rose had not planned sentimentally, but which the calendar had arranged nonetheless. The ceremony was brief and functional, conducted in the magistrate's cold office with his secretary and a passing farmer named Ollie Brandt as witnesses. Caleb wore his cleanest shirt and his Sunday coat, which Rose had not previously known he owned. She wore her dark blue dress that she'd kept pressed and folded at the back of the wardrobe for occasions that hadn't arisen in years. Ollie Brandt shook Caleb's hand afterward with genuine warmth and told Rose she looked fine, which she suspected was the most profound compliment available from Ollie Brandt's emotional register. The secretary offered thin congratulations. The magistrate gave them a certificate and went back to his paperwork. They drove home in the buckboard in the late afternoon cold, sitting close enough that their shoulders touched, and neither of them said very much because the thing that had happened was large enough that it didn't require commentary. The reaction in Mill Haven was precisely what Rose had expected: a swell of gossip, a current of disapproval, and a smaller but genuine undercurrent of people who were either secretly pleased or simply decent enough to mind their own affairs. Mabel Trent told anyone who would listen that Rose had lost her mind. Gerald Cutter, to his credit or his calculation, said nothing publicly, which told Rose he had decided the battle wasn't worth fighting, at least for now. The Hargrove family, who had been good neighbors for 20 years, sent over a jar of preserves and a note that said, "Wishing you both well," which Rose kept. The disapproval, when it came from the direction she had least expected to need to defend herself from. It was a Sunday in late February, 3 weeks after the wedding, when Pastor Dillard's wife, Cecilia, appeared at the homestead with a covered dish, beef stew, Rose could tell from the smell, and an expression that mixed genuine kindness with the particular discomfort of someone who has been designated by community consensus to deliver a message. Rose brought her inside and made coffee, because whatever Cecilia had come to say, she had made the trip in February cold and deserved to say it warmly. Caleb was in the barn. He tended to be in the barn when visitors came, not from cowardice but from instinct. A man who had lived in the mountains knew when to be present and when to make himself scarce. And he was good at reading which situation he was in. "It's not that people don't wish you well," Cecilia began, which Rose recognized as the opening of a sentence whose second half was going to be more honest than its first. "It's just, Rose, the man is 11 years younger than you. People wonder." "What do they wonder about specifically?" Rose asked pleasantly. Cecilia had the grace to look uncomfortable. "His intentions. His intentions were to work this land and build something and marry me, in that order. He's done all three." Rose set down her cup. "Cecilia, you and I have known each other for 15 years. I'll ask you honestly, do you think I'm a foolish woman?" "No," Cecilia said immediately. "That's never been the word for you." "Then trust that I have not been foolish in this." She said it without heat. "Caleb Mercer is a good man, not a perfect one. I'm not in the market for perfect, at my age, and I'd be suspicious of anyone offering it. But a good one, a working one, a man who puts everything he has into what matters to him and keeps nothing in reserve." She paused. "That is, in my experience, the rarest possible kind." Cecilia looked at her for a long moment. Something in her expression shifted, softened, in the way of a woman who has come to deliver a message and found herself reconsidering the message's merits. "He seems quiet," she said finally. It was not the critique it might have been. It was closer to acknowledgement. "He is quiet," Rose agreed. "So am I, when someone gives me the space to be." She picked up her cup again. "The stew smells wonderful. Stay for lunch." Cecilia stayed for lunch. She went home, and if she did not exactly champion the marriage, she at least stopped contributing to the conversation against it. In a small community, this was its own form of victory. Caleb heard the account that evening and was quiet for a moment. Then, "You handled that better than I would have." "You would have been in the barn," Rose said. "I would have stayed in the barn," he agreed without apology. March came, and the land began to wake. It happened gradually, in increments that required paying attention to notice, a particular quality in the afternoon light, the way the snow receded from the south-facing slopes first, the sound of the creek changing its register as the ice began to give. Rose had watched 31 Montana springs arrive on this land, and she still felt something move in her chest when it happened, that inarticulate response to the world insisting on continuing. She and Caleb worked alongside each other in the Long March days with the particular rhythm of two people who have stopped calculating their movements around each other and simply moved. He knew, without being told, when she needed the south field checked, and when the creek level needed watching, and which fence posts had been problematic all winter, and would be the first to go in the spring thaw. She knew when to bring him coffee, and when to leave him alone, and when the silence between them was the comfortable kind, and when it was the kind that had something underneath it, waiting to be said. The south pasture, which she had planted heavier than ever before at his suggestion, was coming in stronger than any spring she could remember. Caleb had modified the drainage on the east side of the field using a system of shallow channels that directed snowmelt away from the lowest lying sections, and the difference was visible already in the color of the emerging soil, darker, richer, better prepared. "Where did you learn that?" she asked him one afternoon, watching him assess the field from its edge. "Watched the mountains do it." He crouched, picked up a handful of the turned earth, examined it. "Water always finds the path you give it. You just have to give it the right one." She looked at him in profile, the weathered lines of his face, the careful attention he gave to everything he looked at, and thought about what it meant to find the right path after years of giving water none to follow. She thought this without embarrassment, which was new. April brought rain, and with the rain came the particular madness of spring ranch work, the kind that overwhelmed every hour of daylight and made you fall into sleep like a stone dropped in water. They worked until they were too tired to think, and in that tiredness something genuine settled between them. The intimacy that comes not from grand gestures but from being in the same mud, in the same cold rain, solving the same stubborn problems at the end of the same long day. One evening in late April, while rain hammered the roof and they ate supper in the comfortable quiet of two people who no longer needed to fill silence with noise, Rose set down her fork and said, without preamble, "I think about them." Caleb looked up. "The boys, Elias and Silas." She looked at the table. "More now than before. I don't know why now." He was quiet for a moment. "Maybe because there's something to come back to now." She considered this. It was the kind of observation he made sometimes. Short, unpretentious, and exactly right in the way a knife is right for a particular task, fitted precisely to the need. "Elias's last letter was from Wyoming," she said. "Wyoming is a large territory." "It is. I don't know if he'd want to." She stopped. "We said things to each other after Thomas died, things that—" She stopped again. This was the part she found hardest to speak about, the specific architecture of that particular wound. "I don't know if some things can be taken back." "I don't think things get taken back," Caleb said carefully. "But I think they can be rebuilt around, the way you fix a broken fence line. You can't unmake the break, but you can put in a post that's stronger than the original." She looked at him across the table. "Do you speak from experience?" He looked back at her steadily. "I speak from watching you work," he said, "and from what I know about the kind of person who runs a homestead alone for 6 years and still gets up every morning." The rain came down harder. Somewhere in the barn, Esther the cow made her opinion of the weather known in one long, indignant sound. Rose almost smiled. "He has a child," she said. "Elias. His last letter mentioned a daughter, Clara." She said the name carefully, as though it might break. "My granddaughter. I don't even know what she looks like." Caleb said nothing. He didn't offer comfort that would have been insufficient or advice that hadn't been asked for. He simply let the words exist in the room, which was sometimes the most useful thing a person could do. "I think," Rose said slowly, "that when the spring work is under control, I think I might write to him." "I think that's right," Caleb said. She picked up her fork. The rain came down. The stove threw its warmth into the room, and outside the Montana spring continued its brutal, necessary work of breaking things open to let them grow again. She would write to Elias. She had decided, sitting at that table with her husband quiet across from her, and her granddaughter's name in the air between them like something newly discovered, that she would write to him. She did not know what he would say. She did not know if what had broken between them could be rebuilt around, as Caleb had put it, or whether the break was too fundamental, too long ago, too loaded with the particular accumulated weight of a grief that had been handled badly by everyone involved. She knew only that she was not the same woman who had watched her eldest son ride east in February 7 years ago. She was not the woman who had stood at this window with $462 worth of ruin closing in from all sides and believed her life was over. She was Rose Whitlock, Rose Mercer now, and the name still felt strange and right in the same breath. And she had learned, over a very hard few years, that the most dangerous assumption a person could make was that a story was finished before the last page had been turned. She would write the letter. Whatever came of it would come of it. Outside, the rain continued, steady and indifferent and absolutely essential, doing what April rain does in Montana, insisting, against all the evidence of the brutal winter just survived, that something new was possible. She wrote the letter on a Tuesday evening in early May, when the last of the spring rain had finally moved east and the valley was doing that particular thing it did in the first true week of warmth. Exhaling, Rose always thought, the way a person exhales after holding their breath for a very long time. She sat at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled close and 3 failed attempts crumpled beside the inkwell, and she wrote the 4th draft without stopping, because she had learned from Thomas's death and her son's departures and 6 years of solitary winters that the things you stop to reconsider are often the things you never send. Dear Elias, she wrote, I am not going to begin this letter by explaining myself because I expect you don't need the explanation, and I wouldn't know where to start. I am writing because I have a granddaughter I have never met, and because I am not willing to go to my grave having never tried. I am not asking you to forget what was said between us. I am asking you to consider whether it was the last word on the subject. I hope you are well. I hope Clara is well. I am well. Better than I have been in years, if I am being honest, and I am trying very hard these days to be honest. Your mother, Rose. She sealed it before she could open it again. She gave it to Petford's boy to carry to the postal office the next morning, and then she went back to work and did not think about it more than 40 or 50 times a day. The waiting was its own kind of labor. She had not told Caleb the precise contents of the letter, only that she'd sent it, and he had nodded and asked no further questions, which she was grateful for. She had lived inside her own head for so long that the habit of privacy was structural, built into her like the beams of the cabin. She was still learning, slowly and imperfectly, that sharing the weight of something did not mean surrendering the thing itself. May moved forward with the relentless productivity of a Montana spring. The south pasture came in full and strong, better than she had hoped, and better still than Petford at the general store had been expecting when she'd negotiated the supply agreement with him in March. He had looked at the first delivery of early greens with a grudging respect that he dressed up as skepticism, because Petford respected things best when he could pretend he hadn't expected to. Your husband's doing? He asked, weighing the produce with unnecessary deliberateness. Our doing, Rose said. He marked his ledger and didn't pursue it, but she noticed he gave her the better price, the one he reserved for suppliers he intended to keep. Caleb's trapline wound down with the warming season, and he turned his full attention to the homestead in a way that transformed the work of maintaining it. He was methodical in a way that complemented her own particular brand of pragmatic efficiency. Where she saw what needed doing, he saw why it had needed doing for longer than she'd admitted and what would need doing next. He rebuilt the entire north wall of the barn in 3 weeks, working from first light until the light failed, using timber he'd cut from the ridge above the property and dragged down himself with the draft horse. She brought him water and food and did not offer help he didn't need, because she had learned that a man who works the way Caleb worked was not being solitary, but was being completely present to the task, and interrupting that presence was its own form of waste. In the evenings, they sat on the porch when the weather allowed, which in May meant sitting with a blanket across your knees and calling it optimism. And they watched the valley do its slow green filling in, the hills going from the muted brown of late winter through that brief, extraordinary moment of yellow-green that lasted exactly 2 weeks before deepening into summer's full register. It was like this when I came here with Thomas, Rose said one evening, watching the last light on the ridge. That first May. We'd been here less than a year and I wasn't sure. About the land. About whether I'd made the right choice, following him out here from Ohio. She paused. I was 21. I thought Montana was the edge of the world. It is somewhat, Caleb said. It is, she agreed, but there are worse places to be at the edge. She looked at him sideways. Where did you come from? Before the mountains? You've never said. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was sometimes quiet, not evasively, but as though he was locating the answer carefully, making sure it was the true one before he offered it. Kansas, originally. Small town called Harrow. My father farmed wheat. He looked at his hands, which were a farmer's hands, and a trapper's hands, and a builder's hands all at once. I left when I was 19. I couldn't breathe flat, he said, with the simplicity of someone describing a medical condition. I needed elevation, space that went vertical instead of horizontal. You never went back? My parents died within a year of each other when I was 24. There wasn't much to go back to after that. He said it without self-pity, the way he always said the hard facts of his life, as weather report, not complaint. I don't regret the mountains. I regret... He stopped, and she waited. I regret that I got so good at being alone that I stopped noticing I didn't want to be. She turned to look at him fully. He was watching the ridge, his profile against the last light, and she thought, not for the first time, that there was something almost geological about Caleb Mercer, something formed by pressure and elevation and time into a particular kind of density that most people would have called hardness, but that she had learned was simply the quality of a thing that had been tested repeatedly and held. You noticed eventually, she said. He looked at her then, and in his eyes was something she had come to recognize as the closest he came to open tenderness, a warmth in the steadiness, like heat inside stone. I knocked on your door, he said. You knocked on my door, she agreed. The letter from Elias came in the 3rd week of June. She was at the fence line on the east side of the property when she saw the postal rider coming down the road, and something in the particular way the morning light was falling, or perhaps some older animal intuition, made her stop what she was doing and walk out to meet him. He handed her a single envelope without ceremony, tipped his hat, and rode on. She stood in the field with the letter in her hands for a long moment before she opened it. The handwriting on the outside was Elias's. She would have known it anywhere. That particular combination of her own careful penmanship and Thomas's broader, more impatient stroke, as though her eldest son had inherited the conflict between them and expressed it in his letter forms. She turned the envelope over once, twice. Then she opened it. The letter was 2 pages. She read it standing in the field, with the morning sun on the back of her neck and the grass moving around her boots, and somewhere in the distance Caleb's hammer starting up against the barn wall in its steady rhythm. Elias wrote the way he had always communicated, directly, without ornament, with the particular terseness of a man who had learned early that words had weight and was careful not to squander them. He acknowledged her letter. He said he had read it more than once. He said that what had happened between them after Thomas died was something he had thought about more than she might expect, and that he was not without his share of what needed to be accounted for. He said that Clara was 4 years old and had her grandmother's eyes, which he said in a way that made Rose understand he meant it as an offering. He said he was in Sheridan, Wyoming, working a cattle operation there, and that the situation was stable. He said, at the bottom of the 2nd page, in a sentence that stood alone as though he had put it there after everything else, and then not moved it, I don't know if I'm ready, but I think I'd like to try. Rose folded the letter. She stood in the field for another moment. Then she walked to the barn and stood in the doorway until Caleb stopped his hammer and looked at her. He wrote back, she said. Caleb looked at her face, reading it with the attentiveness he gave everything. Good or bad? Both, she said. The way most true things are. He nodded once, slowly. What do you need? She thought about it honestly. Time, she said. And then I think we need to go to Wyoming. The decision, once made, settled into her with the particular solidity of right things. She did not agonize over it further. She had done her agonizing in the months of silence before the first letter, in the years of carrying a wound she had not known how to approach. Now there was a door that had opened, barely, an inch, and Rose Whitlock had spent enough of her life not walking through doors to recognize the cost of hesitation. They planned the trip for August, when the most critical summer work on the homestead would be past. She wrote back to Elias, shorter this time, cleaner, telling him she would come if he would receive her, telling him she did not intend to reopen old arguments but to start a different conversation, telling him she was bringing her husband and asking if that was all right. His reply came faster than the first letter. Yes. Come when you're ready. Clara asks about her grandmother. I don't know what to tell her yet, but I'd like to have something to say. Caleb read both letters when she offered them, which she did deliberately, because he was part of this now, and she was done with the habit of keeping everything inside her own borders, as though self-sufficiency were the same thing as virtue. He read them carefully, handed them back, and said, "He sounds like you. Everyone says he looks like Thomas." "He might look like Thomas," Caleb said, "but he writes like you." It was, she thought, one of the more perceptive things anyone had said to her in years. The summer deepened. The South pasture produced beyond expectation, and Petford at the general store expanded their agreement to include summer squash and corn, and by July Rose could see, for the first time in a long time, the shape of a future that was not simply the absence of immediate catastrophe, but something genuinely constructed with weight and dimension and the possibility of continuation. She was not naive. She knew the land would always be demanding, always find new ways to test a person's endurance. She knew that what she and Caleb had built in 6 months was a beginning, not an arrival. She knew the trip to Wyoming carried enormous uncertainty, that Elias might look at her and find only the woman she'd been in her worst moment, that the wounds were perhaps deeper than a letter could bridge, that a granddaughter who had grown up without knowing her might remain a stranger. She knew all of this. She went anyway. They left in the first week of August, before the real heat of the month had set in, traveling light the way Caleb traveled by instinct. A single trunk between them, the horses they'd borrowed back from Hendricks after returning them in the spring, enough supplies for the road. The Hargrove family agreed to watch the homestead in their absence, a favor Rose would repay over the fall in labor and preserves, and the particular currency of goodwill that functioned as its own economy in the valley. The journey to Sheridan was 4 days through country that changed its character considerably once they crossed out of their valley, opening up, flattening, the sky growing larger and more absolute, the wind coming from different directions than she was accustomed to. Rose had not left her immediate territory in years. The world outside her valley felt at once familiar and strange, the way a language sounds when you've heard it but not spoken it in a long time. Caleb was a good traveling companion, which she supposed she should have anticipated. He read the road and the weather with the same attentiveness. He read everything, made decisions about where to stop and when to push forward with quiet authority, managed the horses with the particular ease of a man who had spent more time with animals than with people, and trusted them accordingly. In the evenings, he made camp with the efficiency of long practice, and she sat with him by the fire in the enormous open sky dark of the Wyoming plains, and felt, strangely, at peace with the uncertainty ahead. "Are you afraid?" he asked her the third night. They were 2 days from Sheridan. She thought about it honestly. "Not afraid exactly," she said. "I'm aware of how much I want it to go well, and I know that wanting something badly doesn't make it happen." "No," he agreed, "but it keeps you trying after the first attempt fails." She looked at him across the fire. "You think it'll fail?" "I think first meetings after long silences usually fail a little," he said. "And then you try again, and eventually the trying accumulates into something that holds." He paused. "That's been my experience with things worth building." She thought about the barn wall he'd rebuilt, about the drainage channels in the south pasture, about the way he had shown up at her door with empty hands and cold blue lips and changed the entire trajectory of what she'd thought her life had become. Things worth building, built slowly, in the space between what was broken and what was possible. "You're a hopeful man," she said. "I didn't see that at first." "I'm a patient man," he corrected gently. Hopeful implies a particular expectation about outcomes. Patient just means you keep working regardless. He looked at the fire. Hope sometimes fails you. Patience usually doesn't. Sheridan was a larger town than Mill Haven, with 2 main streets and the particular busyness of a regional cattle center, freight wagons and working horses and men in dusty clothes moving with purpose. They arrived in the early afternoon of the 4th day and asked at the livery stable for the location of the Dunn cattle operation, where Elias Whitlock was foreman, because this was the information his last letter had contained. The liveryman gave them directions without particular curiosity, and they drove out of town on a rutted track that ran northeast for 3 miles into grazing country, low hills and wide grass, and a creek visible in the middle distance catching the afternoon light. Rose saw the buildings from a quarter-mile out. A main house, a bunkhouse, several barns and outbuildings, all of it well maintained in the particular way of a working operation run by someone who took pride in functionality. She saw horses in the near pasture. She saw, as they drew closer, a figure come out of the main barn and stop, shading his eyes against the afternoon sun to look at the approaching buckboard. She knew him from 100 yards away. She would have known him from twice that. He was taller than she remembered, or she had forgotten, in 7 years, the precise dimensions of him. Broad through the shoulders in the way Thomas had been, standing with the particular stillness of a man who has learned to read approaching situations before they arrive. She did not know what she looked like to him after 7 years. She was 52, with 7 more years of Montana written on her face and her hands. She was accompanied by a man he had never met. She was coming toward him across a Wyoming afternoon with her heart behaving in an entirely unreasonable manner while she kept her hands loose and her back straight and her face as composed as she could arrange it. Caleb brought the buckboard to a stop 20 yards from where Elias stood. He did not say anything. He simply set the brake and stayed where he was, which was exactly the right thing to do. Rose got down from the buckboard. She walked toward her son. He was watching her come, and she could not entirely read his expression. There was too much in it, layered the way sediment layers in stone, years of it, compressed and complex. He had Thomas's jaw and her eyes, as Caleb had read in the letter, and now she could confirm was exactly true. He looked tired in the specific way of a man who works hard and carries something he hasn't put down. She stopped 5 feet from him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The Wyoming wind moved between them, warm and indifferent, carrying the smell of grass and horses and the distant creek. "Elias," she said finally. "Mama." His voice was rough in the way of a man who had not said that particular word aloud in 7 years. There was another silence. Then Rose said, because she had promised herself she would say it first and say it cleanly and not make him carry it, "I'm sorry for what I said after your father died. It was wrong, and you didn't deserve it, and I have known that for a long time and not known how to reach you to say so." He looked at her. Something moved through his face, complicated, tidal, the movement of a thing shifting after years of being held in one position. "I said things too," he said. "You did, and I'm not here to assign portions. I'm here because we lost 7 years and I'd prefer not to lose any more." He was quiet for a long moment. Then his eyes moved to the buckboard, where Caleb sat at a respectful distance with the patience of a man who understood that some conversations needed space around them. "That's him," Elias said. It was not quite a question. "That's Caleb, my husband." She kept her voice steady. "He's a good man, Elias. I wouldn't ask you to take my word for it. I know you haven't had reason to trust my judgment on certain things, but he is." Elias looked at Caleb for a long moment with the assessing eyes of a man who spent his working life evaluating animals and equipment and people under pressure. Then he looked back at his mother. "You look better than I expected," he said, and she understood that he had been carrying his own fear into this afternoon. Fear of what 7 years had done to her, what the debt and the isolation and the grief had cost her. "I am better," she said, "better than I have been in a long time." A door opened on the main house across the yard. A small figure appeared in the doorway, backlit by the interior, 4 years old, dark-haired, looking across the yard with the unguarded curiosity of a child who doesn't yet know to be cautious about strangers. "Papa?" The voice was high and clear and carried in the open air. Elias looked over his shoulder at his daughter, then back at his mother. And in his face, in that moment, she saw the thing she had traveled 4 days and 7 years to find. Not forgiveness exactly. That was a larger, slower process. But the first genuine crack in the long accumulated weight of everything that had been left unsaid. The beginning of an opening. "Clara," he called back, and his voice had changed. Softened, the way voices do when they address small children, all the accumulated hardness briefly suspended. "Come meet someone." The small figure detached from the doorway and came across the yard in the unsteady, determined run of a 4-year-old with a specific destination, and Rose watched her coming and felt something break open in her chest. Not painfully, but with the particular irreversible quality of things that have been sealed too long finally meeting air. Clara Whitlock stopped 3 feet away and looked up at her grandmother with her father's directness and her grandmother's eyes, and said, with the confidence of a child who has not yet learned that some questions are complicated, "Are you my grandma?" Rose crouched down to the child's level, which cost her knees considerably more than it would have 20 years ago, and she looked at the small face that was somehow simultaneously a stranger's and the most familiar thing she had seen in years. "Yes," she said, "I am." Clara considered this for exactly 2 seconds. Then she stepped forward and put her arms around Rose's neck with the complete physical confidence of a child who has never had reason to doubt that affection will be received. And Rose held her granddaughter for the first time, in a Wyoming afternoon while the wind moved across the grass, and understood that whatever happened next, whatever difficult conversations remained, whatever repairs still needed making, this moment had already become one of the things she would carry for the rest of her life. Elias watched from where he stood, and his face had something in it that Rose recognized because she felt it herself. The complicated, helpless, entirely necessary emotion of a person being cracked open against their will into something larger than they thought they were capable of. Behind her, at a distance that was respectful and attentive and exactly right, Caleb Mercer sat on the buckboard in the Wyoming afternoon light and waited, with the patience of a man who had learned a long time ago that the things most worth waiting for could not be hurried, and that the best thing a person could offer to a moment that belonged to someone else was simply the gift of not interrupting it. They stayed in Sheridan for 4 days. It was not enough time, and it was exactly the right amount of time, which is the particular paradox of reunions between people who have been estranged long enough that proximity itself requires adjustment, too much of it, too quickly, and the fragile thing being rebuilt collapses under its own weight. Rose understood this the way she understood most things about difficult terrain, by having traversed enough of it to recognize when to push forward and when to make camp and let the ground settle. The first evening was the hardest. Elias had arranged for them to stay in the guest room of the Dunn main house. His employer, a taciturn rancher named George Dunn, had offered it without elaboration, which Rose suspected said something about the kind of employer Elias had found and the kind of employee he had become. They ate supper around a table that had the particular charged quality of a space where people are being very careful with each other, conversation moving in safe channels. The ranch, the weather, Clara's proclivity for collecting interesting rocks, which she demonstrated by producing 3 specimens from her dress pocket and arranging them on the table with the solemnity of a museum curator. Caleb talked to Clara about the rocks. He did it with the same direct, unpatronizing attention he gave everything, asking her where she'd found each one, listening to her explanations with complete seriousness. Clara, who was 4, and therefore an excellent judge of who was actually paying attention versus who was merely performing it, accepted him within approximately 20 minutes, and by the end of supper was sitting next to him, showing him how to properly hold a piece of rose quartz up to the lamp to see the light come through. Rose watched this from across the table and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was still clenched. Elias watched it too. His eyes moved between his daughter and the man his mother had married, and she could see him recalibrating. The way you recalibrate when a thing you'd prepared yourself to distrust presents itself as something other than you'd arranged for. He didn't say anything about it that evening, but she noticed that when he said goodnight, he held her gaze a moment longer than necessary, and something in the set of his jaw had changed from the afternoon's careful wariness to something that had not yet resolved itself into a name, but was moving in the right direction. The hard conversation came on the second evening. Clara had been put to bed. George Dunn had retired early, as working ranchers do. It was just the 3 of them at the kitchen table, Rose, Caleb, and Elias, with coffee going cold in their cups and the Wyoming night pressing at the windows, and Elias looked at his mother across the table with the direct, uncomforted eyes of a man who has decided to stop circling. "I need to say something," he said, "and I need you to let me finish before you respond." "All right," Rose said. He was quiet for a moment, gathering. Then, "When Papa died, I was angry. I know that. I was angry at him for dying, which made no sense, and I was angry at you for, I don't even know, for not stopping it, for still being there when he wasn't, for needing things from me that I didn't know how to give." He stopped, looked at his hands. "I said you'd driven him to his grave. I said—" His jaw tightened. "I said things that weren't true and weren't fair, and I said them because I was 23 years old and I was drowning and I took aim at the nearest solid thing. The nearest solid thing had been her." Rose sat very still and let the words exist in the room. "I left because I couldn't look at you after," he continued. "Not because I hated you. Because I was ashamed, and I didn't know how to be ashamed in front of the person I'd wronged. So I just went. He looked up. And then it was 1 year, and then it was 2, and then it had been long enough that coming back felt impossible, like the distance had become its own kind of statement, even though it wasn't meant to be. I know, Rose said quietly. I don't think you do. I don't think you know how many times I started a letter. His voice roughened. I wrote to Silas about it. When Silas was still... He stopped there, and something moved through his face that Rose couldn't entirely read. She filed that pause away. I just couldn't finish the letter. I didn't know how to explain something I didn't fully understand myself. Elias. She said his name the way she'd said it when he was a boy, not as a correction, but as an anchor. I've had 7 years to think about that winter. What I said to you, the way I handled your father's death, and the way I handled your grief, which was badly, because I was managing my own. She kept her eyes on his. I was 45 years old, and I had just lost the man I'd built my entire adult life beside, and I had 2 sons who needed things from me that I didn't know how to give either. I failed you. Not just in the words, in everything before the words. In the year leading up to that fight, when I was so locked inside my own grief that I couldn't see yours. A pause. I'm sorry, Elias. More than the letter said. I'm sorry in the full, unqualified way, not the kind that comes with explanations attached. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he put his elbows on the table and pressed his hands over his face, and she watched his shoulders do the thing that a man's shoulders do when something that has been held rigid for a very long time is finally allowed to move. And she did not reach for him or look away or fill the silence with anything, because some silences are doing their necessary work, and the kindest thing you can do is let them finish. When he lowered his hands, his eyes were red, but his face was calmer, cleared, the way a sky clears after it has finally done what it needed to do. Caleb, who had been sitting quietly at the edge of this conversation the entire time, reached across the table and refilled both their coffee cups without a word. It was such a precise, unobtrusive gesture, the act of a man who understood that he was witnessing something that did not belong to him, but that he could tend to at its edges. That both Rose and Elias looked at him, and then at each other, and something passed between them that was not quite a smile, but was in the same country. He's all right, Elias said, with the particular Montana economy of a compliment. He's more than all right, Rose said, but I'll let you discover that on your own schedule. On the 3rd day, while Caleb helped Elias with a fence repair on the east pasture, the 2 men falling into the natural working rhythm that men who are good with their hands find regardless of how little they know each other, Rose sat on the porch of the main house with Clara in her lap and a picture book between them, and she read to her granddaughter in the warm August afternoon and felt, with a completeness that was almost frightening, the particular quality of happiness that comes not from the absence of hard things, but from the presence of something that makes the hard things worth having endured. Clara was a child of specific and strongly held opinions. She had views about which rocks were best, which animals at the ranch were trustworthy, and which pages of the picture book deserved extra attention. She fell asleep midway through the 3rd reading of the same story, her dark head heavy against Rose's arm, her breathing the deep, uncomplicated breathing of a child who has no reason to believe the world is anything other than manageable. Rose sat very still and did not move her arm. From the pasture came the sound of hammering, Caleb and Elias at the fence, the same steady rhythm she had listened to for months from inside the cabin, now carrying a different meaning in this different landscape. She could hear, occasionally, the low exchange of voices. Not what they were saying, just the fact of it. 2 men talking, working, finding the particular ease of people discovering they speak the same language even if they haven't met before. She thought about Silas. She thought about the pause in Elias's voice the night before, the way he'd said I wrote to Silas about it, when Silas was still, and then stopped. She had not asked that evening because there had been enough on the table already. But it sat in her now with the particular weight of unfinished business, the kind that makes itself known in the quiet moments. That night, after Clara was in bed and Caleb had gone to check on the horses, she asked, "When you mentioned Silas last night," she said carefully, "you stopped yourself." Elias was quiet. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, the same gesture she made, she noticed, and wondered if he knew it. "I haven't heard from Silas in 8 months, he said finally. The last letter I got from him was from Nevada. He'd lost his position on a cattle drive. He paused, choosing the word with the care of someone who doesn't want to alarm unnecessarily, but won't lie about it either. Low. He sounded low in a way that worried me. Rose felt the particular cold that moves through a parent at certain kinds of news. Not the news itself yet, but the shadow of it, the shape of a fear before it has been fully formed. Low, she said. He'd lost money. Gambling, I think, though he didn't say it directly. And there was something else. Something happened on that drive that he wouldn't talk about clearly. He just said he'd made mistakes he couldn't fix. Elias looked at her directly. I wrote back. I didn't get a reply. That was 8 months ago. The night was very quiet around them. Rose sat with this information and let it settle, the way you let your eyes adjust to darkness, not fighting the absence of light, but waiting for what becomes visible in it. We need to find him, she said. I know, Elias said. I just didn't know I didn't know who to tell. You tell me, Rose said. That's who you tell. You tell me. The return journey to Montana was quieter than the journey out. Not from heaviness, but from the particular fullness of people who have done something significant and are still absorbing its dimensions. They left Sheridan on a Thursday morning, Clara pressed against her grandmother at the buckboard for as long as her father would allow, which was longer than either adult had expected. Elias stood by the road and watched them go with an expression that Rose translated as not yet finished but started, which was all she had asked for and more than she'd been certain she would get. He'll come, Caleb said, when the Sheridan buildings had faded behind them into the Wyoming distance. I think so too, Rose said. When he's ready. He's more ready than he knows. That's often how it works. She looked out at the open country ahead of them. We need to find Silas. Caleb nodded, unsurprised. She had told him, on their last night in Sheridan, what Elias had shared about the younger brother, and he had listened with the careful attention he gave serious information, asking only the questions that clarified rather than the ones that filled space. Nevada is a large territory, he said. Do you have any connection? Anyone who might know where he'd gone from there? There was a man named Cord Pettifer. He and Silas came up together on one of the earlier drives, before the letters went quiet. Silas mentioned him several times. He's from Mill Haven, actually. The Pettifer family has a spread 2 miles south of Hargrove. Might be worth a conversation. It'll be the first one I have when we get home, Rose said. They rode in silence for a while, comfortable and familiar, the kind of silence that two people share when they have been enough miles together that the absence of talking is its own form of communication. The Wyoming grasslands rolled out around them, enormous and indifferent, and the sky overhead was the particular deep blue of late summer altitude, and Rose watched it and thought about the shape of what she was trying to do. Not just the practical dimensions of it, tracking down a lost son in a territory 800 miles wide, but the larger thing underneath, the attempt to pull back together what grief and time and the particular stubbornness of wounded people had allowed to scatter. Thomas had built this family on one piece of Montana land, and one large idea about what a life could look like if you worked hard enough and wanted it badly enough. The land had stayed, the family had not, and now she was doing the thing Thomas had never had the chance to do, putting it back together, not in the original form, because the original form had required Thomas's presence at its center, and Thomas was not coming back, but in a new form. Something that acknowledged the breaks and rebuilt around them, as Caleb had said about fence posts, stronger in the place where it had mended because it had been deliberately made so. They arrived home in the second week of August to find the homestead exactly as they'd left it. The Hargroves had been careful and thorough, which was no more or less than she'd expected, and Rose walked through the cabin and touched its familiar surfaces with a particular gratitude that she had not felt for this place in years. Not the desperate gratitude of a woman clinging to the last thing she had, but the clear-eyed gratitude of someone who understood, now, what she was keeping it for. The conversation with Cord Pettifer happened 2 days after their return. He was a young man in his late 20s, weathered and lean with the sunburned neck of a working cowboy, and he met Rose at his family's property with the wary respect of a person who has been sought out about something he isn't sure he should discuss. Rose sat across from him at his mother's kitchen table and was direct because she had found that direct was almost always the right approach with people who respected working life. I'm not looking to create trouble for Silas, she said. I'm his mother, and I haven't heard from him in over a year, and his brother tells me the last contact was troubling. I need to know if you have any idea where he went from Nevada." Cord looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked at her. "He was in a bad way when I last saw him," he said. "That was about 6 months back in a town called Ridgeline, just over the Nevada border into Utah territory. There was an accident on the drive. A man got hurt. Silas blamed himself for it, though from what I could see it wasn't entirely his fault." He paused. "He was drinking. Heavier than I'd seen him before. He'd lost most of what he had in a card game in Elko." Another pause. "He talked about Montana sometimes, about the homestead, but he also said—" Cord stopped, appeared to decide something. "He said he reckoned he'd done too much wrong to come back to it." Rose sat with this. She was aware of Caleb beside her, the steadying fact of him. "Did he say anything about where he was going from Ridgeline?" "He talked about heading north, back into Idaho maybe. There's mining work up there," he said. "Less people who knew him." Cord looked at her with a directness that suggested he was younger than his experience. "Mrs. Mercer, Silas is a good man underneath it. He just got on the wrong side of his own worst moments and couldn't find his way back." "No," Rose said quietly. "None of us can, on our own." She went home and sat at the kitchen table where she had sat through 100 difficult evenings, and she looked at the account books for a while without seeing them, and then she set them aside and looked at the wall instead, at the particular quality of the afternoon light coming through the window. And she thought about Silas at 20 years old laughing in this kitchen, laughing the way he always laughed, with his whole body, unguarded, as though the world were fundamentally a comic enterprise and he was in on the joke. She thought about Silas at whatever age he was now, 27, in some mining camp in Idaho, or sleeping rough between one place and another, carrying the weight of a man he'd watched get hurt and a card game gone wrong, and 7 years of distance from the only home he'd ever known, telling himself he'd done too much wrong to come back. "He doesn't know," she said aloud. Caleb was at the stove. He turned. "He doesn't know that it's different now," Rose said. "He's carrying a picture of this place and this family that's 7 years out of date. He thinks he's coming back to the weight of everything that drove him away in the first place, the grief and the debt and the—" She stopped. "He doesn't know it's changed." "Then someone has to tell him," Caleb said. "Someone has to go get him," Rose said. "And it can't be me this time. He needs—" She thought carefully. "He needs someone he doesn't have a history with, someone who doesn't carry all the associations." She looked at her husband. "He needs someone who went looking for him specifically, who chose him." Caleb was quiet for a moment, his eyes steady on hers. "You're asking me to go to Idaho." "I'm asking you if you'd be willing," she said. "It's different." He considered it in the way he considered everything, thoroughly, without theater. "I don't know your son," he said. "No, but you know what it is to be so far in your own solitude that you can't see the door back out. You told me so yourself." She held his gaze. "I think you might be the only person who can speak to him in a language he'll actually hear right now." A long silence. Outside, the Montana summer moved through the valley in its fullness. The grass high and green, the creek running clear, the whole abundant, demanding landscape doing what it always did, which was existing with complete indifference to human difficulty while somehow requiring the very best of human effort to survive in it. "Idaho is a long ride," Caleb said finally. "Yes," Rose agreed. "Give me 2 weeks to get the fall preparations far enough along that you can manage the rest." She felt the specific gratitude that comes not from being rescued, but from being partnered, the kind that knows the difference between the two. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "I haven't found him." "You'll find him." She said it without qualification because she had spent the better part of a year watching this man move through the world, and she had learned to trust the quality of his attention. He found what he went looking for, not because he was lucky, but because he didn't stop. The 2 weeks moved fast, as late summer weeks do when there is work enough to fill them twice over. Rose and Caleb worked the fall preparation with the focused efficiency of people who understand each other's capabilities and don't waste time on coordination they've already built into habit. The kitchen garden came in for its last harvest, the most productive she'd had in years, And she stood at the end of the south pasture one evening and looked at what the season had yielded and felt the satisfaction of a thing well made. Elias wrote once during those 2 weeks, a short letter, more comfortable in its tone than anything she'd received from him in years, mentioning that Clara had been asking about the grandmother with the warm hands and the nice reading voice. Rose read this sentence 3 times. Then she wrote back and told him about the plan to find Silas, and asked if there was anything he wanted her to pass along when they did. His reply came the day before Caleb left for Idaho. 4 lines. Tell him I'm not angry. Tell him the door isn't locked. Tell him Clara has eyes like Mama, and he should come see for himself. Tell him I'm sorry too. He'll know what for. Rose folded this letter and put it in the breast pocket of Caleb's coat the morning he saddled up for the journey north. She pressed her hand flat against the pocket for a moment after, feeling the paper beneath it. Come back, she said. Which was not the same as be careful. It was more specific than that. It was the particular request of a woman who had lost people she loved to distance and time, and the particular human talent for disappearing, and who was asking plainly and without apology for this one not to. Caleb put his hand over hers, just briefly. I'll come back, he said, and I'll bring your son. He rode north on a September morning, while the first cool breath of the coming autumn moved through the valley, and Rose stood on the porch and watched him go until the road bent around the spruce trees and took him out of sight. Then she turned back to the homestead, her homestead, hers and his together, the land that had demanded everything she had and was finally, at long last, beginning to give something back. And she went inside and started the day's work. She was not afraid. She was not without worry. But she was, in the deepest available sense of the word, not alone. Not in the way she had been alone for 6 years. Not in the structural, bone-deep solitude that she had lived inside for so long that she'd stopped being able to feel its full weight until something had come along and begun to lift it. There were letters on the table from Elias. There was a granddaughter in Wyoming who had her grandmother's eyes. There was a husband riding north to bring home a lost son who didn't yet know that the home he was being brought back to was something entirely different from the one he remembered. And there was the land itself, going about its ancient and different business in the September light. The creek finding its level, the aspens on the ridge beginning their slow turn toward gold, the whole enormous Montana landscape doing what it had always done, which was outlast everything, and wait, and remain, for whoever was strong enough or lucky enough or stubborn enough to still be standing in it when the season finally changed. Rose Whitlock, Rose Mercer, put on her work gloves and went out into it. Caleb had been gone 11 days when the first real frost came to the valley. Rose woke to it on a Thursday morning, that particular quality of stillness that precedes the first hard freeze, the air inside the cabin carrying a cold it hadn't had the night before. The kind that settles into the walls while a person sleeps and announces itself the moment they open their eyes. She lay still for a moment in the way she had learned not to do in the 6 years she'd spent waking alone into silent mornings. Because in those years the stillness had been a weight, and she had trained herself to move before she could feel its full pressure. Now she let herself lie still and feel the absence of him beside her, not as loss, but as a temporary condition, the way a field feels empty between plantings rather than permanently barren. She got up. She started the stove. She went to work. The rhythm of the homestead without Caleb had a different quality than the solitude of the years before him. It was not silence, but a kind of held breath, the particular state of a place and a person waiting for something that is coming, rather than fearing something that has already arrived. She managed the morning chores with the efficiency of long practice, and she did not pretend that she wasn't watching the North Road at intervals throughout the day because pretending would have been dishonest, and she had made a decision somewhere in the past year to be done with the particular self-deception of performing composure for an audience of no one. On the morning of the 14th day, she was at the fence line on the east side of the property when she saw 2 riders on the North Road. She did not run. She was 52 years old, and the ground between her and the road was uneven, and she was a practical woman. But she walked faster than she had walked in a while, and she arrived at the fence gate as the riders turned in from the road, and she stood with her hand on the post and looked at what Caleb had brought back from Idaho. She would not have recognized Silas if she had passed him on a street in Millhaven. He was 27 years old, and he looked older than that by a margin that had nothing to do with years and everything to do with the kind of living that leaves marks faster than time does. He was thinner than she remembered. Her younger son had always carried the easy, unthinking physicality of a young man who doesn't yet have to consider his body's limits, and that was gone. He sat his horse with the cautious posture of someone who had recently been in pain or was still in it. His face, when he looked at her from 20 yards out, had the particular expression of a man who has been rehearsing a moment and has now arrived in it and found that none of the rehearsal was adequate. Caleb stopped his horse at the gate. His eyes found hers immediately, and in them she read the shorthand they had developed over a year of paying attention to each other. It was hard. He came anyway. Be careful with him. She pushed the gate open and walked toward her younger son, and he got down from his horse, moving stiffly, she noticed, favoring his left side, and stood with the reins in his hands and looked at her with those eyes that were still the eyes she remembered, still her eyes, even in a face that had been roughed considerably by the years between. "Mama." His voice came out cracked, and he stopped, swallowed, tried again. I don't know how to... Silas. She closed the distance between them and put her arms around him the way she had put her arms around Clara in the Wyoming afternoon, without reservation, without the careful management of a person protecting themselves from further disappointment. She held her younger son and felt him go rigid with the resistance of someone who has been braced against something for so long they don't know how to stop bracing. And then, slowly, felt that rigidity begin to give way, the way ice gives way in March. Not all at once, but from the edges inward, surrendering to something warmer than itself. He held on to her with the grip of a man who has been at the very end of his rope and knows it. "I'm sorry," he said into her shoulder. "Mama, I'm so sorry. For leaving, for not writing, for all of it. Hush," she said, which was what she had said to him when he was small and had scraped himself on something, and the pain was outrunning his ability to be reasonable about it. "Hush. You're here now. That's the part that matters." She felt him shudder once, and then something in him let go, the specific audible release of a person setting down something they have carried too far. Behind them, Caleb led both horses quietly to the barn without being asked. He did not look back. He understood, as he understood most things about what was needed when, that this was a moment with an exact number of people in it, and he was not one of them. She brought Silas inside and made him sit and fed him, and did not ask questions, not because she didn't have them, but because she had learned in a year of careful attention that the right information comes out at its own speed when a person feels genuinely safe, and that pressing for it before that safety is established produces only the shape of answers without the truth inside them. She let him eat. She let the warmth of the cabin do what warmth does. She watched the tight, hunted quality around his eyes begin, very slightly, to ease. Caleb came in from the barn and sat at the table and accepted coffee and said, with the comfortable directness of someone who has figured out a person during 4 hard days of travel, "Your brother sends a message. He said to tell you he's not angry, and the door isn't locked, and Clara has your mother's eyes." Silas looked up from his plate. Something crossed his face that was too complicated to name cleanly. It had grief in it, and relief, and the specific pain of a person being told that the connection they feared they'd severed permanently has been quietly maintained from the other side. "You went to see Elias?" he asked his mother. "We went to Sheridan in August," Rose said. "It took a letter and 4 days and about 20 years off my heart, but we went. And he's..." Silas stopped. "He's all right?" "He's more than all right. He has a daughter named Clara, and she is the most opinionated 4-year-old I have encountered in 5 decades of living, and she has absolutely your father's stubbornness, and absolutely my eyes. And if you don't find a way to meet her within the year, I will consider it a personal failure." The thing that moved across Silas's face then was, she realized, the first genuine smile she'd seen on it since he'd ridden through the gate, and it was still recognizably his. Still that particular unguarded quality, even if it was thinner and more tentative than it used to be, like a fire that had nearly gone out and was finding its way back from embers. "Clara," he said, tasting the name the way you taste something you hadn't expected to be offered. "Clara," Rose confirmed. "She collects rocks. She has views about which ones have personalities." Silas almost laughed. Not quite, but almost, and almost was enough for a first day. That evening, after Silas had slept for 3 hours in the room that used to be his, and had woken looking fractionally more like a man who remembered who he was, he and Caleb sat on the porch in the last of the September light, while Rose made supper, and she could hear the low exchange of their voices through the open window without making out the words, and she did not try to make them out. She cooked and listened to the sound of it. Two men she loved, one long and one newly, finding the particular frequency of a conversation between people who have been through something hard together and come out the other side of it still upright. Later, she would learn, in pieces, what the 11 days had contained. Caleb had ridden into Idaho on a trail of secondhand information, the mining camps near the Nevada border, a town called Cutter's Flat, where someone matching Silas's description had been working odd jobs, and then farther north, higher, into the kind of territory that attracts men specifically because it doesn't ask questions. He had found Silas in a logging camp outside a nothing town called Greystone, working a crosscut saw for 40 cents a day and sleeping in a bunkhouse with 11 other men and looking, by Caleb's account, like someone who had made a decision to disappear so gradually that even he wouldn't notice when it was complete. Caleb had introduced himself without preamble. "My name is Caleb Mercer. I married your mother in February. She sent me to find you." He had said later that Silas's first response had been to look at him for a long moment and then say, "She sent someone else. She must have thought I wouldn't come for her." And Caleb had said, "She thought you'd come for someone who didn't already carry all the weight of what happened between you. She was trying to make it easier." And Silas had been quiet for a while after that. The conversation that followed had taken most of a night and all of the next day, which Caleb had described only in outline and which Rose understood she would only ever have in outline, because some conversations between men traveling hard roads together belonged to the road and not to the people waiting at the end of it. What mattered was what it had produced. Silas packing his single canvas bag, settling what he owed at the camp, riding south with a man he'd just met toward a home he'd told himself he'd forfeited. "He said something to me," Caleb told Rose on the second night after their return, when Silas was asleep and the house was quiet. They were sitting at the kitchen table in the way they had been sitting at kitchen tables together for nearly a year, and the lamp was burning low, and the frost was doing its slow work on the grass outside, and she was watching her husband's face in the way she had learned to watch it, attentively, without pressure, waiting for what he chose to offer. "He said the hardest thing about being lost isn't being lost," Caleb said. "It's being convinced that the people you left behind have adjusted to your absence, that you've become a solved problem." He paused. "He said he kept not writing because he assumed you'd stopped expecting him." Rose was quiet for a moment. "I never stopped expecting him," she said. "I stopped hoping for him, for a while. Hoping and expecting are different things." "That's what I told him," Caleb said. "More or less." She looked at him across the table. "What would you have done," she asked carefully, "if he'd refused to come?" He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about everything. "Written down your message and left it with him," he said, "and told him the door was open and come home." He met her eyes, and then gone back in the spring. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and they sat like that in the quiet kitchen while the frost settled into the valley and the cabin held its warmth against the dark, and neither of them said anything more because nothing more was required. The weeks that followed had a quality Rose had no existing vocabulary for, because she had never experienced anything quite like them. Silas moved through the homestead with the careful, tentative movements of someone relearning a space they'd thought they'd lost. Touching things, she noticed, often. The corner of the kitchen table, the iron peg above the fireplace where Thomas's rifle had hung for years before Rose had replaced it with the shotgun. The particular view from the east window where you could see the ridge through the aspen trees and catch the light in the afternoon. He was not the Silas who had left. She had prepared herself for this, because you cannot have 7 hard years wash over a person and expect them to emerge unchanged, and she did not want the Silas who had left. That boy was gone, and mourning him would have been a way of failing the man who had come back in his place. This Silas was quieter, more careful with words. He had the slightly watchful quality of someone who has learned to read rooms and situations because he has been in rooms and situations that required reading. But underneath the changes, the essential thing was intact. That warmth, that orientation toward the world as a place worth engaging with rather than merely surviving. That willingness to be moved by things. It was banked lower than it had been at 20, but it was there, and it was finding its way back toward the surface with every passing day in a place that was not asking it to be anything other than what it was. He and Caleb worked together on the fall preparations with the natural ease of men who are both accustomed to reading what needs doing and doing it without ceremony. She watched them from the window sometimes, not anxiously, but with the quiet pleasure of watching a thing take shape that you had hoped for without knowing if hope was reasonable. Caleb did not try to befriend Silas in any deliberate way, which was exactly right. He simply worked alongside him and spoke plainly and made room for him in the rhythm of the homestead's days without requiring anything in return. Silas, for his part, observed Caleb with the particular attention of a man deciding what he thinks of someone who has married his mother, and what Rose could see him concluding over the weeks was the same thing Elias had concluded in Wyoming, that this was a man who meant what he did and did what he meant, and that this was in the end the only quality that truly mattered. One evening in late October, when the aspens on the ridge had completed their turn to gold, and the air had taken on the specific crystalline quality of a Montana fall that is about to become a Montana winter, Silas came and stood beside his mother at the kitchen window and looked out at the view she had looked at for 31 years. "I used to think about this window," he said, "when I was away. I'd try to remember exactly what it looked like, and I could never quite get it right." "Memory does that," she said. "Makes things slightly wrong." "It made everything smaller," he said. "In my memory it was all smaller. The cabin, the view, the—" He stopped. "You. I kept remembering you as, I don't know, smaller." She looked at him sideways. "I'm the same height I've always been." "That's not what I mean." He was quiet for a moment, working out how to say the thing he was trying to say with the careful precision of a man who has learned that imprecision causes damage he couldn't undo. "I think I was carrying a version of you that was easier to leave, like I'd made you smaller in my head so the leaving would feel less like what it was." "And what was it?" she asked gently. "Wrong," he said simply. "It was wrong, Mama. I knew it when I did it, and I kept going anyway because I was 20 years old and I thought distance would fix something that only staying and working at it could fix." He looked at her. "I'm sorry." "I know you are," she said, "and I need you to understand that I've done my own accounting on this. You were 20. You were grieving. You did what young men do when they don't know what else to do, which is move." She turned to face him fully. "What matters now is what you do with the time that's left, not the time that went." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he put his arm around her shoulders the way he had when he was a teenager and she'd had a hard day. That casual, uncomplicated affection of a son who hasn't yet lost the ease of it. And she leaned into it and they stood at the window together, looking out at the view that had been here for 31 years and intended to remain. The letter from Elias arrived the first week of November, addressed to both of them. "Dear Mama and Silas," which was the first time those names had appeared in the same salutation in 7 years. It was longer than his previous letters, more relaxed in its tone, as though the muscle of communicating with his family was coming back to use after long atrophy. He wrote about the ranch. He wrote about Clara, who had recently decided that horses were superior to all other animals, and was pursuing this conviction with a zeal that exhausted her father and amused everyone else. He wrote that the Dunn operation was expanding, and there might be an opportunity for a man with cattle experience if anyone were looking. He did not make it explicit. He didn't have to. Rose looked at Silas across the table when they'd both read it. "He's asking if you want to come," she said. Silas reread the relevant paragraph. Something moved through his face, complicated, personal, the specific emotion of a man being handed a door he wasn't sure he'd be allowed back through. "He knows I've got no money," he said. "And history with gambling, that isn't a recommendation." "He knows all of that," Rose said. "He's asking anyway." "He's changed," Silas said quietly. "We've all changed," Rose said. "That's generally what 7 years does to a person if they're paying any attention." Silas looked at the letter for a long moment. Then he put it down and looked out the window at the November valley, the aspens bare now, the grass flattened and pale, the ridgeline hard and clear against a gray sky. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they are memorizing rather than something they are seeing for the first time. "I'm not ready yet," he said. "To go to Wyoming, I need, he paused, I need a season here first, to get back to something solid, and then maybe. Then maybe, Rose agreed. It was enough. It was more than enough. The winter arrived in earnest 3 weeks later, and for the first time in 7 years, the Whitlock homestead had 3 people in it to receive it. Silas proved himself useful in ways that had always been there, Rose thought, and simply needed the right conditions to emerge. He was good with animals in the instinctive way of people for whom patience and attentiveness come naturally when they are not being spent on managing their own private chaos. He took over the barn work with a thoroughness that freed Caleb for the heavier structural maintenance the place still needed, and the two of them fell into a working arrangement that had its own particular efficiency, the quiet collaboration of men who are not competing for position because each has found his. In the evenings, the 3 of them sat by the stove and played cards sometimes, or just talked, or sat in the comfortable collective silence of people who have stopped needing to fill each other's space. Silas told stories. He had always been the storyteller, the one with the narrative gift that Rose had always thought he'd either find a use for or let go completely to waste. And she listened to him recount the years of cattle drives and wide-open country with the mixture of laughter and rueful distance of a man who has figured out which parts of his past were genuinely good and which parts he had mistaken for adventure, because the alternative was admitting he was running. He told the true version, which she respected more than the easy one. He was, she could see, becoming himself again. Not the self he'd been at 20. That version was gone, and she did not miss it, because that self had still needed to become this one. He was becoming the man who had been available all along inside the boy who'd needed to go break himself against the world a little before he could understand what he'd had to begin with. Christmas came. It was not elaborate. Montana winters did not easily support elaborate, and none of the people in the Whitlock homestead were inclined toward it in any case. But Rose made the preserved peaches she'd been setting aside since August, and Silas traded with the Hargroves for venison, and Caleb cut a small spruce from the ridge and brought it inside, which he presented with the expression of a man who is doing something he is slightly embarrassed to be doing, but has decided is worth the embarrassment, and they put candles on it, and the cabin smelled like pine and wood smoke, and the particular warm closeness of people who have arrived at a good place through a great deal of difficult country. Silas raised his tin cup on Christmas Eve and said, without self-consciousness, to the woman who kept the door open. Rose looked at her younger son across the table. She looked at her husband beside her. She thought about the door, the actual door of the cabin, the one she had opened on a November night a year ago into a blizzard that contained, improbably, the rest of her life. She thought about the other doors, the one that had opened when she wrote to Elias, the one that had opened when Caleb rode 11 days into Idaho and brought her son home, the one that was still, slowly and deliberately, opening between the brothers who had been too far apart for too long. The door, she said, was never really closed. I just couldn't see it for a while. They drank to that. Elias came in the spring. He drove up from Sheridan in the first week of April with Clara on the buckboard beside him, and a look on his face that Rose read immediately as a man who has made a significant decision and is at peace with it. He got down from the buckboard and looked at the homestead, the rebuilt barn wall, the reinforced fence line, the south pasture already showing the first green of the new season, the general aspect of a place that has been properly tended, and she could see him taking the inventory of it, revising the image he'd been carrying. Then Clara spotted the horses through the fence and all organized observation ceased. Silas came out of the barn at the sound of the buckboard and stood in the yard and looked at his brother, and the distance between them, the actual physical distance of 15 feet and the figurative distance of 7 years, occupied the air for a moment with its full weight. Rose stood on the porch and did not intervene. Caleb appeared beside her with the coffee pot and poured her a cup, and she accepted it without looking away from her sons. Elias walked across the yard and stopped in front of his brother. He was taller than Silas, had always been, and broader, and the combination of his height and his physical stillness gave him the appearance of something settled and substantial. He looked at Silas with the expression of an older brother who has been angry for years and has done the work of figuring out what the anger was actually about, and has arrived at a different destination than he expected. "You look terrible," Elias said. "You look old," Silas said. There was a fractional pause, and then something broke open in both of them simultaneously. Not tears exactly, but the specific emotional release that men sometimes express as something closer to laughter relief, and grief, and love arriving together in the only form the situation allows. And they closed the distance between them in the unself-conscious, graceless way of brothers who have not yet lost the habit of each other despite everything. Rose turned and went inside because some things belong to the people in them. She sat at the kitchen table with her coffee while Caleb leaned in the doorway and watched the yard, and she did not need to see what was happening outside to know what it was. She had known what it would be the moment she'd sat down in January of the previous year with a pen and a lamp and written a letter she'd been afraid to write for 7 years. She had known it the way she knew the spring was coming while the ground was still frozen, not as certainty exactly, but as the conviction of a person who has been on this land long enough to understand its patterns. After a while, Clara came running in from the direction of the fence, boots loud on the porch boards, and stopped in the doorway with the specific bright-eyed energy of a child who has just made an important discovery. "There are 2 horses," she announced, as though this were information of immediate civic importance. "There are," Rose confirmed. "The brown one let me touch her nose." "That's Biscuit. She lets most people touch her nose." "I think she likes me best," Clara said, with the serene certainty of a 4-year-old who has no structural capacity for self-doubt. "I think you're probably right," Rose said. Clara climbed onto the chair across the table and put her elbows on the surface and looked at her grandmother with the same direct, considering attention that Rose recognized in Elias and that Elias had inherited, she had always thought, from her. "Are you happy, Grandma?" she asked, with the exact precision of a child asking the only question that matters. Rose looked at this small, serious face. She looked at the kitchen around her kitchen, the one she had stood in alone for 6 years, and the one she had shared for 12 months with a man who had knocked on her door in a blizzard and changed the entire course of what her life would be. She listened to the sound of her sons outside, the low exchange of voices finally in the same place again. She thought about the South pasture ready for its second strong season, and the mortgage paid and the letters going back and forth from Wyoming, and the granddaughter sitting across from her asking whether she was happy with the gravity of someone conducting an important survey. "Yes," she said, "I am." Clara nodded, satisfied, as though this had confirmed something she had suspected. Then she climbed back down from the chair with the focused energy of a child who has completed one task and is ready for the next. "Can we see the other horse now?" she asked. "We can see all the horses you want," Rose said, and took her granddaughter's hand and went outside into the April morning where her sons were standing together in the yard, and her husband was coming across from the barn with the particular quiet warmth in his expression that she had learned was the closest he came to openly visible joy, and the South pasture was greening in the new season's light, and the valley was doing what it had always done and would keep doing, holding all of this, the grief and the labor, and the long-delayed love, and the people stubborn and fortunate enough to still be standing in it, in its enormous and indifferent and absolutely necessary embrace. She had opened a door on a November night into a blizzard, and what had come through was not just a man, it was this, all of this. A family rebuilt around its breaks, stronger at the mended places. Sons returned. A granddaughter who collected rocks and had her grandmother's eyes and asked the exact right questions without knowing how rare that was. A homestead that had survived everything the land and the creditors and 6 solitary winters could throw at it, and was still here, still producing, still demanding and rewarding in equal measure the best that anyone on it had to offer. Rose Whitlock, Rose Mercer, stood in the April light with her granddaughter's hand in hers and looked at the life she had built twice. Once with Thomas, out of youth and hope and the particular recklessness of people who don't yet know what they're asking of themselves. And once again out of something harder and better, out of loss survived and loneliness outlasted and the specific courage of a woman who had been ready to give up and instead had opened the door. The greatest miracle was not keeping the ranch. She understood that now, fully and without remainder. The greatest miracle was every subsequent thing that keeping the ranch had made possible. Every letter written and received, every mile traveled toward people who needed finding, every evening by the stove in the warmth of a house that was a home again. Every morning she woke to the sound of other people beginning their days in the same walls. The greatest miracle was this ordinary April morning, unremarkable to anyone who hadn't lived through what it had taken to arrive at it. She held her granddaughter's hand. She watched her sons. She felt, beside her and around her, and running through the whole unbroken fabric of the day, the presence of the life she had chosen when she chose to keep fighting, when she chose not to close the door against the storm. She had opened the door. Everything else had walked through it, the end.